Story 1. The man at the end of my driveway? After my divorce, my daughter and I moved into a small house on a quiet suburban street because I needed to believe we could start over somewhere that didn't carry old memories. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, almost forgettable, with trimmed lawns and porch lights that stayed on long after dark. During our first week there, I developed a habit of checking that my car was locked before going to bed. One night, I noticed someone standing at the very end of my driveway. They weren't doing anything unusual, so I assumed they were just a neighbor walking home. I went inside without giving it another thought. The next night they were there again, standing in exactly the same place, completely still. That was the moment I should have trusted the uneasy feeling I couldn't explain. Looking back now, I honestly believe that if I had called the police that first night instead of dismissing it, everything that happened afterward might have been completely different. Normal life and character building. Life settled into a simple rhythm after that. Every morning I packed my daughter's lunch, walked her to the bus stop, and returned home to unpack another few boxes before starting work on my laptop. Most afternoons ended with another trip to the hardware store, because the house always seemed to need something small. At night we usually ordered takeout since neither of us had the energy to cook. Pizza became our Friday tradition, while Chinese food somehow turned into Tuesday comfort. The neighborhood felt welcoming without being intrusive. Mr. Collins across the street waved whenever he mowed his lawn. An elderly woman named Denise always walked her golden retriever before sunset. Families kept their gardens tidy, children rode bicycles until dinner, and porch lights slowly flickered on as daylight disappeared. Everything about the street suggested stability, exactly what I thought we both needed. My daughter adjusted faster than I did. She decorated her new bedroom with drawings and stuffed animals, talked about making friends at school, and insisted our little house already felt like home. Hearing that made every difficult decision leading to the move seem worthwhile. Bedtime quickly became our favorite routine. We brushed our teeth together, read one chapter from the same adventure book every evening. Then I tucked her in before walking through the house, checking every window and door. The last thing I always did was step onto the porch and press the button on my car key to make sure it was locked. Standing there for those few quiet seconds became strangely comforting. The street stayed silent, the air felt still, and I honestly believed we were finally safe. Even on weekends, we explored nearby parks, bought groceries together, laughed over mismatched unpacked dishes, and slowly imagined this place becoming our permanent home someday. Early warning signs the following night, I looked before pressing the button on my keys. The figure was there again, standing in exactly the same place at the end of my driveway. It didn't shift its weight, glance around, or acknowledge anyone. It simply stood there as though it had been waiting long before I stepped outside. For several nights, the pattern never changed. I would finish checking the house, step onto the porch, and see the same motionless silhouette. It never came closer, never walked away while I watched, never waved or called out. Eventually, I started wondering whether someone nearby worked late and passed through every evening. One afternoon, I casually asked Mr. Collins if he knew the person who kept standing near my driveway after dark. He looked confused and said he had never seen anyone there. Denise said the same thing the next day. Their answers unsettled me, but I convinced myself our schedules probably didn't overlap. I installed a small security camera above the garage, mostly for peace of mind. The recordings showed empty pavement every single night. Sometimes there was a blurry shadow, but nothing recognizable. I replayed the footage again and again, comparing it with what I remembered seeing. Looking back, I realized I spent too much time inventing reasonable explanations because accepting the truth felt impossible. I blamed exhaustion, stress, the divorce, poor lighting, and my own imagination. Every excuse made me feel safer for one more night. Denial, more than fear, became my first mistake. By the time I admitted something was genuinely wrong, the routine had already become part of my life, and whatever stood there every night somehow seemed to expect me to look. I never understood why until much later, when everything finally changed forever before dawn arrived again outside home. Escalation. After that, the nights stopped feeling ordinary. I still tried convincing myself everything had a logical explanation, but the figure began appearing more consistently than before. It wasn't every few nights anymore. It was almost every single evening, usually waiting before I even stepped onto the porch. At first I thought nothing had changed, until one night I realized it wasn't standing at the curb anymore. It had moved a few feet closer, close enough that I noticed without having to look twice. That small difference stayed with me all day. I barely slept because every little sound outside made me check the bedroom window. My mornings became slower, my patience shorter, and even simple conversations at work felt exhausting. Coffee replaced proper sleep, yet I still counted the hours until darkness returned. I hated that part most. I wasn't checking because I expected to see someone. I was checking because I was afraid I wouldn't. One morning, while I was making breakfast, my daughter looked out the kitchen window and casually asked, "Is the man outside coming back tonight?" She said it the same way a child might ask whether the mail had arrived. My stomach dropped. I asked what man she meant, trying to sound calm. She shrugged and said, "The one who stands by the driveway sometimes." Then she went back to eating cereal, as if it meant nothing. After that, little things started happening around the house. The motion lights switched on in the middle of the night without anyone outside. I found the side gate standing open twice, even though I knew I had latched it. After one evening of heavy rain, muddy footprints crossed part of the driveway before disappearing across the grass. They weren't clear enough to identify, but they were impossible to ignore. Even our neighbor's friendly Labrador, which usually barked at squirrels and delivery trucks, refused to walk anywhere near the front of our property after sunset. I became obsessed with my nightly routine. Instead of checking the car once, I checked it 3 or 4 times before bed. Sometimes I stood behind the curtains for several minutes, watching the end of the driveway without blinking. Peak event. A week after the waving started, a thunderstorm rolled across the neighborhood just before midnight. Rain hammered the roof, lightning flashed every few seconds, and I finally convinced myself that if someone was really standing outside, the weather would force them to leave. I grabbed a flashlight, stepped onto the porch, and walked slowly down the driveway despite every instinct telling me to stay inside. When I reached the end of the driveway, there was nobody there. The street was completely empty. Rainwater flowed along the curb, tree branches swayed in the wind, and every house looked dark except for a few porch lights glowing through the storm. I actually laughed under my breath, embarrassed that I had frightened myself for weeks. Then I turned around. The same man was standing perfectly still on my front porch. He hadn't been there a second earlier. Before I could even shout, the front door opened behind him. My daughter peeked outside and called my name, wondering why I was standing in the rain. I ran toward the house as fast as I could, never taking my eyes off the figure. Halfway up the driveway, lightning flashed again. The porch was empty. There was no broken window, no forced door, and nothing inside the house had been touched. But across the wet wooden boards were several muddy footprints leading directly to the front door, stopping there without any prints leaving afterward. Aftermath. Police arrived before sunrise, but they found nothing unusual. They photographed the muddy footprints, searched the yard, and asked nearby neighbors whether anyone had seen a stranger. Everyone shook their heads. After that, people stopped chatting with me the way they used to. My daughter refused to sleep alone and cried whenever darkness settled outside. I installed cameras on every corner of the house, but none ever captured anything useful. Weeks passed, and the fear never left. Eventually, I sold the house for less than it was worth because staying felt impossible. We moved across the state, hoping distance would finally give us peace. It never truly did. Some nights, I still check the end of every driveway before sleeping. Lingering ending. Several years later, while visiting the area for work, curiosity got the better of me. I drove slowly down the old street just to see the house one last time. Everything looked different, yet strangely familiar. Fresh paint covered the walls, children's toys sat in the yard, and the driveway was completely empty. I told myself we had finally escaped whatever haunted those memories. Then I checked my rearview mirror before turning the corner. Standing at the very end of the driveway was a motionless figure, exactly where I had first seen him. I kept driving and never looked back again. Story 2. Every night, someone knocked at 3:17 a.m. The first apartment I ever rented on my own was a tiny place a few blocks from my university. After years of sharing a room with family, having my own space felt exciting, even if the building was old and the rent was barely affordable. Most nights I stayed awake studying, playing games, or finishing assignments until exhaustion finally caught up with me. Then, during my second week there, something started happening that changed the way I thought about being alone. Every night, without fail, at exactly 3:17 a.m., someone knocked on my apartment door. 3 knocks. Always slow. Always evenly spaced. Never louder. Never softer. The first few nights, I froze in bed, waiting for whoever it was to leave. I kept telling myself there had to be a simple explanation. Looking back, I wish I had trusted the feeling in my stomach instead of my own logic. Because eventually curiosity got the better of me. And the biggest mistake I have ever made in my life was opening that door myself that night. Normal life and character building? Before everything became difficult to explain, my life was about as ordinary as any university student's. My classes didn't usually end until late evening, so I spent most afternoons on campus before catching the last bus home. By the time I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I was usually carrying a backpack full of books, a cheap microwave meal, and far too much caffeine. The building itself had probably seen better decades. The elevator had been broken for months, so everyone used the narrow staircase that echoed with every footstep. The hallways were long, dimly lit, and painted the same faded beige from floor to ceiling. Because the walls were so thin, you could hear televisions, conversations, running water, and sometimes arguments from neighboring apartments without trying. I slowly became familiar with the people living around me. An elderly man watered the plants outside his door every morning. Across the hall lived a young couple who always seemed to be rushing somewhere together. We exchanged polite greetings but never really spoke beyond that. Everyone mostly kept to themselves. My routine rarely changed. I'd heat up dinner, finish assignments, then reward myself with an hour or two of online games before getting ready for bed. Almost every night I called my parents before sleeping. My mother always reminded me to eat properly, while my father asked whether I needed money, even when I insisted I was managing fine. Those conversations made the apartment feel less empty. Despite its age, the place felt safe. The front entrance required a key. Every apartment had sturdy locks, and the neighborhood was surprisingly quiet after midnight. Nothing about the building suggested that anything unusual had ever happened there. Looking back now, that's probably why the first knock seemed so easy to dismiss. It simply didn't belong in a place where every other part of life felt completely normal and predictable every single day afterward. Early warning signs, the knocking continued the next night, and the one after that. Every time I looked at my phone, it read exactly 3:17 a.m., as though someone had set an alarm I couldn't turn off. 3 slow knocks echoed through the apartment. They were never aggressive or frantic. Somehow, that made them worse. Whoever was outside sounded patient, almost certain I would eventually answer. The first few times I opened the door immediately after the final knock, the hallway was always empty. The old fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the worn carpet stretched toward the stairwell, and every apartment door remained closed. There was nowhere anyone could have disappeared that quickly without making noise. Eventually I asked the couple across the hall whether they had heard someone knocking late at night. They exchanged confused looks and said they slept straight through until morning. The elderly man downstairs laughed politely and suggested I was probably hearing pipes expanding in the walls. Nobody admitted hearing anything unusual. I even tried recording the sound with my phone. I placed it beside the front door before going to bed, convinced I would finally prove it wasn't my imagination. Every morning I replayed the recording. Silence. Not a single knock appeared, even though I remembered hearing each one clearly. Without realizing it, I stopped sleeping normally. Instead of going to bed, I stayed awake waiting for 3:17. Some nights I sat in complete darkness, watching the clock count down minute by minute. Classes became harder to focus on. My grades slipped, and simple conversations felt exhausting. Friends joked that university life was finally catching up with me. I laughed with them because it was easier than explaining the truth. Deep down, though, I knew I wasn't waiting for the knocks anymore. I was waiting to discover who wanted me awake every single night. Escalation. The pattern continued for weeks until it became part of my life in the worst possible way. Every evening, I caught myself checking the clock, wondering how many hours remained before 3:17. No matter how distracted I kept myself with assignments, games, or television, that time always found me. The 3 slow knocks never changed. They sounded deliberate, almost polite, like someone who knew I was awake and simply expected patience in return. Then something else started happening. About 30 seconds after the final knock, I began hearing footsteps in the hallway. They weren't rushed. Whoever it was walked slowly past my apartment door, stopped for several seconds, then continued toward the stairwell. Whenever I looked through the peephole, the hallway was completely empty. Even stranger, the footsteps always sounded close enough that I should have seen someone. A few nights later, I rested my hand against the inside of the door after the knocking stopped. That's when I felt it. The handle moved, not violently. Just enough to tell me someone on the other side had gently tried it. I froze without making a sound. After several seconds, the pressure disappeared. I waited nearly 10 minutes before checking the hallway. Again, there was nobody there. Around the same time, small things outside my apartment began changing. 2 packages I had ordered showed as delivered, but they never reached my door. The delivery company insisted they had left them in the correct place. One rainy morning, I found a line of wet footprints leading toward my apartment. They stopped directly outside my door, but there were no matching prints leading away. I stared at them for several minutes, trying to understand how that was even possible before they slowly dried and disappeared. The atmosphere inside the building changed too. One afternoon, I noticed the young couple across the hall carrying boxes into a moving truck. They left so quickly that I never had a chance to ask why. Their apartment stayed empty afterward. When I casually mentioned it to the building manager, he simply said people moved all the time. I asked whether previous tenants in my apartment had ever complained about strange noises at night. His expression changed for only a second before he smiled and said he couldn't discuss former residents. That answer stayed with me longer than I expected. From then on, I constantly felt watched. Whether I was walking down the hallway, climbing the stairs, or unlocking my apartment, I had the uncomfortable sensation that someone was standing just beyond the edge of my vision. Every unexpected sound made my heart race. Then one night, I looked at my phone after hearing the first knock. It was 3:14 a.m. for the first time since everything had begun. Whoever stood outside my door hadn't waited until 3:17. Instead, it had arrived early. And somehow, that frightened me more than anything that had happened before. Peak event. By the end of the 4th week, I couldn't take it anymore. Fear had stopped feeling sharp and had turned into exhaustion. I barely recognized myself in the mirror. Every night revolved around waiting, and every morning began with pretending nothing was wrong. When the clock finally reached 3:17 again, I stood beside the door before the first knock even came. 1, 2, 3. The instant the final knock faded, I unlocked the deadbolt, twisted the handle, and pulled the door open as fast as I could. The hallway was empty. Not almost empty. Completely empty. Every apartment door was closed. The lights buzzed overhead exactly as they always had. There wasn't a single sound except my own heartbeat. I stepped into the hallway and looked toward the stairs, then toward the elevator that never worked. Nobody was there. Story 3. It waited outside my bedroom window. Losing my job forced me to move back into my parents' house at an age when I thought I had already built a life of my own. It was embarrassing, but they never made me feel unwelcome. My old bedroom had barely changed since high school, right down to the faded posters and the window that overlooked the backyard. Beyond the grass stood an old wooden swing set my father had built years earlier. It had weathered with time, but neither of us ever found the heart to take it down. One night, while getting ready for bed, I glanced through the window and noticed what looked like someone standing beside the swing set. I blinked, looked again, and convinced myself it was nothing more than shadows mixing with the branches in the darkness. The following evening, though, I checked without thinking. The figure was there again, standing in the exact same place. That was the moment I should have stopped telling myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Instead, I closed the curtains and tried to forget what I had seen. Normal life and character building. Moving back home wasn't part of my plan, but after the first few weeks it became surprisingly comforting. My parents had settled into routines that hadn't changed much over the years. My father still woke before sunrise to tend the garden, and my mother still insisted that everyone sit together for dinner, no matter how busy the day had been. Those evenings around the kitchen table slowly became the best part of my day. We talked about ordinary things, laughed at old family stories, and avoided discussing my lost job unless I brought it up myself. Living there again felt strangely familiar. I knew every creaking floorboard, every cabinet that stuck when you opened it, and every shortcut through the neighborhood. I started taking evening walks along the same streets where I had ridden my bike as a kid. Most of the houses looked exactly as I remembered them. Only the children playing outside had become adults with families of their own. The backyard carried the strongest memories. During summer vacations, I spent countless afternoons there, climbing trees, chasing insects across the grass, and swinging so high that I imagined I could touch the clouds. Even after all those years, the old swing set remained standing near the back fence. The wood had faded, and one chain squeaked whenever the wind caught it, but seeing it every morning made the house feel unchanged in the best possible way. At night, I often left my bedroom window slightly open to let the cool air inside. I would sit on the edge of my bed listening to crickets, distant traffic, and the occasional barking dog. Everything about those quiet evenings reminded me why the house had always felt safe. Looking back now, I realize that sense of comfort made it much easier to ignore the first things that didn't belong. Nostalgia has a way of convincing you that familiar places could never truly become frightening until they quietly do. Early warning signs. The figure became part of my evenings before I fully admitted it to myself. Every night, almost without thinking, I looked through my bedroom window before closing the curtains. Every night, it was standing in the same place beyond the reach of the porch light. It never wandered around the yard or stepped closer to the house. As far as I could tell, it simply faced the windows as though quietly watching. At first, I tried changing the angle of the blinds, thinking reflections from inside the room might be creating strange shapes outside. I even walked into the backyard during daylight, expecting to find a tree branch or garden decoration that looked different after sunset. Nothing matched what I had been seeing. Eventually, I mentioned it during dinner. My parents exchanged amused smiles. My father joked that I had probably been reading too many scary stories online, while my mother suggested I was still stressed about finding another job. Their laughter wasn't cruel. I honestly believed there had to be a simple explanation, and part of me wanted to believe them too. To settle the question, my father installed a motion camera overlooking the backyard. We checked the recordings every morning for nearly escalation after the first couple of weeks. Something changed so gradually that I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. The figure wasn't standing beside the old swing set anymore. One evening it seemed slightly closer to the house. The difference was small, but once I noticed it, I couldn't stop paying attention. To make sure my memory wasn't playing tricks on me, I started using landmarks in the backyard. The swing set, the bird feeder, the fence, the garden shed, and an old tree stump became reference points. Every night I looked through the same corner of my bedroom window and compared where the figure stood. It wasn't moving while I watched, but from one night to the next it always seemed to have gained a little more ground. Within a week, it had reached the fence. A few nights later it was standing beside the garden shed. The distance between us was shrinking one quiet evening at a time. I told my parents again, this time insisting that something was different. My father walked outside with a flashlight while I watched from the bedroom window. He searched every corner of the yard, checked behind the shed, looked around the fence, and even walked beyond the property line. He came back inside shaking his head. There was nobody there. The camera recordings remained exactly the same. Empty yard, moving trees, nothing else. Even Max behaved strangely. Instead of lying at the back door like he usually did, he refused to step into the yard after sunset. If someone opened the door, he backed away with his tail tucked between his legs and stared toward the darkness without making a sound. Seeing a dog that had spent years chasing squirrels, suddenly afraid of the backyard, unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Eventually, the figure stood only a few feet from my bedroom window. I stopped leaving the curtains open altogether. Every evening I shut the blinds before the sun disappeared because I couldn't bear the thought of looking outside anymore. The problem was that not looking became almost impossible. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, and every scrape of tree branches against the roof made me wonder whether something was waiting just beyond the glass. Sleep disappeared completely. I spent hours lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening for sounds from outside. Sometimes I imagined footsteps across the grass. Other times I thought I heard the swing chains moving, even when there wasn't enough wind to make them sway. Then one morning I opened the blinds after sunrise. Just below my bedroom window, pressed into the aftermath. The police searched the property before sunrise. They walked the fence line, examined the flower beds beneath my window, checked the shed, and even looked through the neighboring yards. Aside from the muddy ground left by the storm, they found nothing that could explain what I had seen. My parents tried to reassure me, but I could tell the experience had unsettled them too. Within a month, I accepted a job in another city and moved away without hesitation. I never spent another night in that bedroom. About a year later, my parents quietly decided to sell the house. They never gave me a reason. I never asked. Some answers felt more frightening than not knowing at all. Lingering ending. Several years later, I spent a weekend visiting my parents in their new home. Before going to bed, I walked past the back window out of habit and glanced into the yard. It was smaller than our old one, with a simple wooden fence along the property line. Everything looked peaceful until my eyes adjusted to the darkness. Near the fence stood a motionless figure facing the house. It wasn't moving. It wasn't hiding. It was simply waiting. I closed the curtains without another look. Since that night, I have never slept with a bedroom window uncovered again, anywhere I have lived.